good day or good evening, however that applies. Welcome to the 6th episode of Creation, Genesis, and Origins. I'm Dick Fisher with my co-host Ken Miller. In the previous episode, we examined the biblical ancestors described in Genesis 5 and compared the Genesis record to the king lists recorded in Sumerian that were found in some of the earliest cities in southern Mesopotamia. And we found enough agreement to see that some historical basis does exist where we can begin to examine the Genesis text through the eyes of a historian. It's early history to be sure and fragmentary, and certainly should not be confused with human history, but it can be viewed as a decent, even inspired version of early Semitic history. Genesis 2 through 11 tells the story of the biblical peoples, some of whom were ancestral to the Messiah. And the story, indeed the lineage, begins with Adam.
The biblical story and the story of early civilization begins in the same place, southern Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq.
Civilization means life in cities. It means large populations with great ceremonial buildings. It means writing. And all these things are found for the first time on Earth, here in this ferocious landscape of South Iraq, Old Sumer. Here was the first law, the first science, the first war. And now, what remains is a stark warning to our pride in the human achievement, for this is all that's left of the world's first cities.
Due to the mention in Genesis 4 of farming, livestock, tents, stringed musical instruments, and artifacts made of copper and iron even before the flood, Adam has credibility as a real-life historical individual living no earlier than 10,000 years ago in the Neolithic or at the beginning of the Chalcolithic Period. But there is no possibility he could have been the biological progenitor of the entire human race, since our species, Homo sapiens, is known from the fossil record to have been living 200,000 years ago. As evidenced by Genesis itself, and supported by literature from the ancient Near East, Adam's existence belongs to a time roughly between 5,000 to 4,000 BC in southern Mesopotamia, near the confluence of the 4 rivers of Eden, Genesis 2, 11 to 14.
Although many archaeologists, Sumerologists, and biblical scholars have offered insights and opinions over the years, we will try to extract the parts that are pertinent and include evidence to back them up.
This is a map of ancient Sumer, or Shinar in Hebrew, as you will see it identified in Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament. We pointed out in an earlier episode that the rivers shown on this map equate to the rivers described in Genesis 2, 10 to 14, and the Persian Gulf is shown as it would have appeared at that time. There has been a persistent confusion over the location of the Gihon River that has lasted for 2,000 years. The Kushites, or Kassites, descended originally from Noah's grandson, Cush, son of Ham, Genesis 10:6. Originally, they settled in what is now western Iran, and the river is the Karkeh, joined by the Kashkan, that flows out of a province called Khuzestan to this day. The problem was that this was not a good place to settle long term. The early settlement was sandwiched between the aggressive Babylonians and the warlike Assyrians to the west, and the Elamites to the south, who eventually destroyed Sumer in 2000 BC. At some point, the Kushites realized they were not in a happy place, and at least some, or perhaps all, relocated to East Africa south of Egypt, where they could live in peace. And the newly established tribe named their portion of the Nile River after the river of their homeland, the Gihon. When the historian Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, compiled the history of the Jews, he apparently was unaware of the early location and ventured that the Gihon was the Nile River, even though the Nile empties into the Mediterranean Sea and the Euphrates flows to the Persian Gulf. There's no way these rivers could come in contact anywhere. Nevertheless, the King James translators followed suit, and instead of the tribal name Cush, they inserted Ethiopia in Genesis 2:13, further throwing Bible scholars off the track for another 400 years.
Students of world history are taught that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent and the ancient Near East. Identifying the various cultures that have flourished there has been done with meticulous care, made possible by years of compiling archaeological data. The earliest identifiable people belong to the Neolithic Natufian culture, which was spread from Palestine to Syria and date to about 12,500 to 10,500 years ago, clearly a pre-Adamic date. The oldest city identified with Natufian culture was Jericho.
Just for clarity, pottery remains discovered in ancient and long-abandoned villages serve to help establish the origins of ancient cultures, their lifestyles, diets, and other relevant information. When a location is excavated, the pottery remains are examined, and if they are unique to that site, then the people who live there bear the same name. The name Natufian, for example, comes from Wadi an-Natuf in Israel, located about halfway between Tel Aviv and Ramallah. When subsequent sites are excavated that contain the same pottery style, then people who lived there are called by the same name as those who lived in the first site excavated. We have no idea what the Natufians might have called themselves.
Natufians were sedentary, or at least semi-sedentary. Some evidence for the cultivation of cereals such as rye was found, although in general Natufians made use of wild cereals, and they hunted animals such as gazelles.
The Hassuna culture takes its name from the mound of Tel Hassuna in northwestern Iraq and dates from 6000 to 5250 BC. Numerous agricultural villages have been unearthed in Iran, Turkey, and Palestine, contemporaneous with the Hassuna. Identified with their coarse pottery wares, these people were replaced gradually by the Samara culture dating about 5500 BC. At Tel Es-Sawan in Iraq, alabaster female figurines were discovered, along with ornaments of turquoise, carnelian, greenstone, and copper. The presence of widely disparate materials in one location indicates trading practices, and that trading routes had been established by that time.